Good morning. This is the YouTube channel of The Study and Institute for IAS. Myself Aman Jha, and today is the fourth lecture of NCERT concept series. We had started with the history NCERT of class 6. So let's start. The name of the book, Our Past One. Okay. See, this is the index of the book. If you recall, in the last lecture we had covered up to the period of Mauryan Empire and the Emperor Ashok. The next two chapters, chapter 9, Vital Villages and Thriving Towns, and chapter 10, Traders, Kings and Pilgrims. See, what happened actually in the post-Mauryan Empire, that there was a rapid fragmentation of political structure. There were many smaller kingdoms. So, instead of making the subject boring by talking unnecessarily about each and every kingdoms and empires, what the NCERT does, that it tries to focus on certain processes that were continuing from the time of second urbanization. When the second urbanization started from the period of Mahajanpad, okay, many political and socio-economic changes were taking place. And what underpinned those changes, they have covered it in this chapter, and then they have covered some non-political events of post-Mauryan period in chapter 10. And then from 11, they go towards the Gupta Empire. Okay, so this is the theme of these two chapters. First talks about the continuities from the previous era, and that goes further, and then it talks about certain things, certain issues like traders, kings and pilgrims of post-Mauryan period. Okay, we shall see them in detail. See, actually what had happened, that the process of second urbanization, which started at this time, continued right throughout the ancient India. Okay, therefore they are highlighting in these two chapters the processes that contributed to that process. Okay, see, the journey so far has been that we started with the wandering hunter-gatherers. We know from 2 million years ago till 10,000 years ago, human beings were in the phase of hunting and gathering. Then the earliest villages, when people settled down to practice farming. On the basis of earliest villages, local cultures emerged, though they have not mentioned it in 6th class NCERT, but they are certainly a part of the syllabus, and you will cover them in your optionals or GS. Then on the basis of local cultures, the first urbanization happened, okay, in the Harappan cities. Then it declined, though the causes of decline are numerous and not certain. After that, Vedic period and megalithic cultures. There were two, early Vedic period and later Vedic period, and they were concentrated into northwestern and northern part of the subcontinent. For rest of the subcontinent, we focus on the megalithic cultures, especially Deccan and South India. Okay, from this, second urbanization began in the Mahajanpad period. All right. Now during the Mahajanpad period, the urbanization spread into the northwest, north and even central India. However, for south, we still depend on megalithic cultures. And you also know, from Mahajanpad period emerged Magad Mahajanpad, from Magad Mahajanpad emerged Magad Empire, and from Magad Empire emerged the Mauryan Empire. And Mauryan Empire was spread from Afghanistan to Karnataka and from West Bengal to Gujarat. For rest of the, especially for deep south, these megalithic cultures, which were Iron Age cultures, They had a very, in previous lectures we had seen that they had a very wide subsistence base. Okay, they practiced trade, even their society was differentiated. That means there was considerable difference between rich and poor. So they were at the state of incipient, they were not entirely state polities, but they were on the cusp of urbanization and state formation. They were on the cusp of urbanization and state formation. And then from Mauryan age to post-Mauryan age comes up. And during post-Mauryan age, South India and Deccan reaches to the stage of urbanization and state. Okay, we will look into them in this chapter. See, post-Mauryan age is roughly considered from 200 BCE to 300 CE. Why? Because this is the period between Mauryan Empire and Gupta Empire. Okay, though Gupta Empire began slightly later than 300 CE and Mauryan Empire ended slightly later than 200 BCE, but as we have repeatedly emphasized that dates are not that important. Dates are merely milestones. Okay, they give you a frame of reference to think from, but they are not that important. You don't need to cram them. Now, what happened in the post-Mauryan period? Rapid decline of Mauryan Empire after Ashok. Okay, within few decades of Ashok's death, the Mauryan Empire declined and it was replaced by different kingdoms in different parts of the empire. And there are very good political and economic reasons behind this decline, but right now they are outside the merit and jurisdiction of this book. So they will be covered when you pick up your optional subject. And what are the sources to know about those different kingdoms? Coins issued by them, inscriptions, and books. Now, books could be religious or non-religious. And here are some examples of those. For example, earliest were Indo-Greeks. They were replaced by Shaks and they were replaced by Kushans. They primarily dominated northwestern India, northern India, and western India. For a while, Shakas were subordinates of Kushans. See, first Shakas came, but when the Kushanas came, they became subordinate to them, and once the Kushan Empire was ended, they once again became prominent, especially in the western India. You must hear about this Girnar inscription of Rudradaman, which is the first long inscription in pure Sanskrit. It was issued by a Shaka king, Rudradaman. Okay. See, not only this book, but even we are not going to focus that much on the dynastic history. Okay, dynastic history is not that important. We are only mentioning them in passing. So this was for northwest, north and western part of India. See, Shung dynasty was established by one of the generals of Mauryan Empire. Okay, and Shungas were replaced by Kanwas, and this is for eastern India, for Bihar, eastern UP. Okay. In Deccan, modern day Maharashtra, Andhra, etc., Satavahanas were the first empires, and they were later replaced by Vakataks, which are, though to be fair, kind of belong to the Gupta period. So mainly Satavahan were the important ones for post-Mauryan period. And in deep south, Chol, Cher, Pandyas, they were the earliest kingdoms. They were called Muvendars. We will discuss them later in the chapter. Okay. And then they were replaced by Pallavas in southern Andhra, Tamil Nadu, and Chalukyas, though they are broadly contemporaries of Gupta Empire. So, strictly speaking, for the post-Mauryan period, you are supposed to be concerned with Satavahanas and Chol, Cher, Pandyas. These and they mostly belong to the Gupta period. Okay, and this is the extent of the political dynasty you need to know about, not more than that. More than that, a slight amount will come in your optionals. See, here we will see that one of the sources we said coins, and here is the example. This is an Indo-Greek coin. In fact, coins of Indo-Greek kings is the only source to know about them. And this is a Kushan coin. See, whenever you play a sport, you have to toss. You toss a coin. And when you toss a coin, you say head or tail. But in modern coins, there is no head, there is no tail. Actually, the tradition of head and tail comes from these ancient coins. Here, on the obverse side, there are two sides of a coin, obverse and reverse. Okay, this might not be visible here. Obverse and reverse. So reverse, you all know from cricket what is reverse. On the back side, this is the obverse side, front side. Here, this is the depiction of the king which issued it. This is the name of the king written in Greek. And on the reverse side, often they would have, depiction of certain deity. Now, it could be a Greek deity, it could be a Roman deity, or in some cases, even Indian deity. Okay. Similarly, this is the portrayal of the king. This is the name of the king. Now, it could be written in a language depending upon the area of circulation of the coin. And then on the reverse side, they would have image of a deity. In some of the cases, we know about certain kings only from their coins. There are no other sources to know about them. Other socio-economic changes in the post-modern period were, see, growth of urbanization based on agricultural growth, craft production, trade and state formation continued apace. Okay, that means what started with second urbanization in Ganga Valley, okay, continued through post-Mauryan period as well. See, let's discuss a small correlation here. Let's say you start with agricultural surplus, okay, or agricultural production. In last lecture, we had talked about that how kings tax this surplus, okay, and using that surplus, they create an efficient bureaucracy, large standing armies, they fortified their cities, and this helps them in expanding and strengthening their empire. So, one way, by taxing it, state formation is encouraged. Now, agricultural surplus allows people, freedom to practice non-agricultural trades. See, if there is not enough surplus in society, then everyone will be forced to work in agriculture because the first requirement is to eat. But if you are producing enough surplus in society, then certain people can stop farming activities and go towards non-farming activities. So, a surplus allows craft proliferation, okay, more and more people can start practicing craft, some of them will specialize, there will be craft proliferation. Also, this craft proliferation and this agricultural surplus promotes trade, and all these three, state formation, trade and craft proliferation, promote urbanization. What is the hallmark of urbanization? That if a majority of population in a settlement practices non-agrarian occupation, okay, if they are doing some non-agricultural work, then you can call that a particular settlement is urbanized. So, agricultural surplus is at the base of state formation, craft proliferation, trade, and all these are related to urbanization. Also, trade is linked to currency system, right? So, what we said here, that the growth of urbanization based on agricultural growth, craft production, trade and state formation continued. Monsoon winds were discovered in this period. We know that South Asia has a monsoon climate, meaning monsoon means a seasonal reversal of the winds. We have two sorts of winds, northeastern winds that blow from northeast, and we have southwestern winds, and they periodically change their direction. So what happens? Suppose you want to come towards Indian subcontinent from the direction of East Africa or Arabian Peninsula. You should preferably come during the monsoon season because the wind help you. And if suppose you want to go towards in reverse direction, then you should take the period of northeast monsoon. So monsoon winds helped in oceanic trade, and Silk Route was also developed during this period. They connected Indian subcontinent with Central and West Asia, East Africa and Southeast Asia. So both oceanic and land route for international trade as well as trade within the subcontinent also flourished during this period. Now, urbanization, state formation, etc. Obviously, they will promote art and architecture. The earliest temples and stupas, books and scientific discoveries were made in this period, and these simultaneous developments influenced each other also. Okay, see this was the Silk Route. Okay, this image is given in the book. See, this part was under the control of China. Okay, this part of the route. This part of the route here was under the control of Iranian, this red one, Iran or Persians. This was under the control of Roman Empire, and this part, the green lines, okay, they were under the control of Kushanas, that which were a Central Asian come Indian empire. See, from here, from Peshawar down the Indus River system, a route goes towards sea, and from here you can go towards the Persian Gulf, from here you can go towards Red Sea. So both West Asia and from here you can go to Mediterranean world. Both West Asia and Mediterranean world were connected via Arabian Ocean. And if an empire, see, the reason different empires competed each other to control segments of Silk Route is because you can tax the trade. You can not only tax agricultural surplus, you can tax trade as well, and using that you become resource rich and you expand your empire. Now here, if you can see, they have mentioned some ports. This is Masulipatam. Here there was a Tamralipti, but they have not mentioned Tamralipti in this map for some reason. Okay, is Berigaza, Bharuch. Berigaza word is used in Greek sources. Here is Barabarikam near modern Karachi, and they have mentioned some ports here. So Patma, they have mentioned Poduka, which sounds like a modern Pondicherry, and then you have Mujris. See, these names have been picked up from Greek sources, okay, and that is why they sound rather non-Indian. Now there could be a prelims question. There has already been few questions regarding ports and Buddhist centers. Okay, so for example, they can ask that which of the following were important ports in Indian Ocean in ancient India. We saw Poduka and Supatama. These were in Tamil Nadu area. Here we saw them. Okay, and Barabarikam, I said this is near the modern Karachi. So the answer will be all three, all of the above, you will write. Okay. Actually, the chapter starts now. The information before it was given in separate tables in the book. Okay. The chapter talks about vital villages and thriving cities, and why they have picked it up. They have given the answer right away. They said the kingdoms that we have seen till now, Mahajanpads, empires, etc., they could not have existed without the flourishing villages. And how could they flourish? Obviously, unless you have agricultural growth in villages, there will be not only trade but even craft specialization, taxation, everything will be impacted. So urbanization will suffer. State formation will also suffer. So how could they flourish? So they have given some answers. They say that use of iron began around 1000 BCE. Some of the largest collection of iron tools and weapons were found in the megalithic burials. Okay. But around 500 years later, in 500 BCE, there is evidence for the growing use of iron tools in farming. These included axes for clearing forest, iron plowshare, sickle and hoe. Therefore, due to this, agricultural production increased, that is surplus increase. That surplus was taxed. Okay, and then it helped to build the empire. Now this argument that what they are essentially saying, or rather highlighting, is the role of iron in second urbanization. Okay, they are highlighting the role of iron in second urbanization, and this is essentially a Marxist view. This is a view of Marxist historiography. When you start studying optional, in optional you will see different historiographical opinions on this thing. Okay, apart from Marxist, you will see revisionist opinions, etc. So first they say, or rather credit iron. Second, other technology, a new knowledge of paddy transplantation. And apart from iron and paddy transplantation, they talk about that irrigation works including canals, wells, tanks and artificial lakes were built, because up to this time state as well as people understood that economic growth leads to increase in political power, increase in economic prosperity. And they have given a wonderful exercise here in the book. They say fill in the rest by using the following phrase. Okay, they have given some options and there are some blank spots. Let's try to fill it. They say kings need money for armies, palaces and forts. So they demand taxes. Okay, what will you do next? Kings provide money. Okay, so first they demand taxes from farmers. Therefore, should be the third. Farmers have to increase production to pay taxes. Okay. Then they say this is the fourth one. This is possible with irrigation. So first they have given two: iron. They have given paddy transplantation. These knowledges have been existing for a while, and now there is a active state-led infrastructure growth. I mean, this is nothing different than modern government expenditure on infrastructure. Even modern governments build highways, build airports, build railway lines, build canal networks, okay, spend money on agricultural research and development. This is something very similar to that. So apart from iron and paddy transplantation, they say ki it is possible with irrigation. What they do? That kings will provide them money, a kind of what we today call public investment. In today we would say it public investment. Okay, and planned irrigation works. So public investment plus planning, both. Labor is provided by people. So king said that okay, I am giving you investment and planning, now you provide labor. So that will be sixth. Seventh, production increases, so does revenue, therefore state becomes more powerful. And ninth, farmers also benefit because crop production is more certain. So both there is economic growth, public welfare, and state becomes powerful as well. Now, social impact of prosperous villages. Here we saw that the end was that we have prosperous villages at our hand. At the end of this, virtuous cycle of investment, economic survey uses this word, virtuous cycle of investment. At the end of this virtuous cycle, we have prosperous villages. And what is the social impact of prosperous villages? See, you would see that whenever in a society, when wealth increases, inequality is bound to increase. This is the way of modern life, no escaping it. And that inequality is not represented by only two extremes, that this is 0, everybody is abject poor here, and this is 100, everybody is, so you cannot say that all the wealth will be concentrated here and there will be no wealth here. Actually what happens, you have a hierarchy. Okay, you have a hierarchy, something like a pyramid. At the base, the population will be most numerous yet least wealthy, abject poverty. And then every successive class will have more wealth, less population, and at the top you have the quintessential 1% of people that control a lot of wealth, yet they are numerically very small. So prosperity means wealth is bound to bring inequality, and it looks like this structure. Now This pyramid could be very steep. Say a very large number of people are poor with very little wealth, and at the top there are very small number of people with lots of wealth. So that inequality will vary from society to society. But whenever there is prosperity, there will be inequality, there will be social differentiation. They have given a few terms, and these terms have been derived from sources like Sangam literature. Okay, sources like Sangam literature. They have given some terms, they have picked those terms from that literature, and they have highlighted that the societies had become unequal at this point. How? Vellar, this word is even popular today. Large landowners of Tamil region are called Vellar, Ujwahar, ordinary ploughmen, Kadesiyar and Adimai, landless laborers, and then they had slave laborers. And in North India, you have village headman come largest landowner, okay, Gram Bhojaka. He was not only village headman, means he had political power, and they acquired this political power by first amassing wealth. Now you can say that they may have acquired wealth first and political power later, or political power first and wealth later. So you know what came first, chicken or egg? They were not only, even they were controlling the society. They presided over the local disputes, they controlled law and order, and helped government, kings or provincial officials to collect taxes. So these rich folks had a complete control on the society. Often their, village headman position was hereditary. So son will succeed his father, like a village level king, you can say. Then you had Grihapatis, who were small landowners, somewhat like Ujwahar of South India. Das Karmakar. So Das is slave and Karmakar is wage laborer. And then you had craftsmen like blacksmiths, potter, carpenter, weaver. So in the post-Mauryan period, villages looked somewhat like what they look today, that you have very rich people, you have moderately rich people, and then you have a vast number of poor people who live at the bare subsistence. Again, you can frame a prelims question on the basis of these three words, Kadesiyar, Adimai, Ujwahar. You had seen here what Kadesiyar and Adimai mean. Kadesiyar and Adimai means landless laborers, and Ujwahar means ordinary ploughmen. See, Vellar is a very popular term, so it is unlikely that they will ask what a Vellar means. Okay. Then finding out about the cities. See, the name of the chapter is Vital Villages, Thriving Cities. We saw that for a strong state, when a king tries to build a strong state, prosperous villages are part of the process. Similarly, thriving towns are also not only prosperous villages, even thriving towns will be the part of the process of state formation. How? Let's see here. See, here we saw state formation. We saw the portion about villages. See, a strong state requires capital. We saw that they will fortify their capital, etc. So that contributes to urbanization. Sorry. Okay, my mistake. See how they contribute to cities, or rather, in fact, even cities contribute to them. Why? Because you can, tax the economic activities going on in the cities. You can tax trade, you can tax craftsmanship. We had seen in previous lecture that they would tax laborers, craft persons in terms of their work. that out of every week you serve 1 or 2 days for king. You will tax the sale of goods by traders. So state formation contributes to cities urbanization, and urbanization contributes to state formation. And how urban this does? First, state needs capital. Second, what we saw, thriving villages will allow people to practice non-agricultural activities, crafts. Okay. Also, these surplus will be traded, even crafts will be traded, and even these two, see, where would the craftsmen live? They will live in the cities. Where will the traders live? They will live in the cities. So, also a taxation system means currency system. It is bound to contribute to currency system. A taxation system or large scale transaction, it contributes to currency system as well. And therefore, in the Mahajanpad period, we saw the first coins of the Indian subcontinent called the punch marked coin. So to recap, state formation contributes to prosperous villages and vice versa. State formation contributes to urbanization and vice versa, means urbanization contributes to state formation. How? First, state can tax the economic activities going on in the cities. Also, kings need capitals. Also, craft persons will then live in cities, not in capital necessarily, some other cities, craft based cities. Traders will live in the cities, they will trade in the city, and urbanization, trade, all these things need currency. You need a medium of exchange, and therefore it is not a coincidence that the first coins of the Indian subcontinent, called the punch mark coins, about which we will see later, they first appeared during the Mahajanpad period. So this is the relation between these activities. So first we talked about villages, and now we are talking about cities. What are the sources to know about these cities? Stories, travelers, means traveling, they must have left their accounts. Sculptures and archaeology, we will see each them one by one. See, first source is Sangam literature. It becomes a source especially from the post-Mauryan period. For post-Mauryan period, Sangam literature is a very important source, and Sangam literature have this concept of Tinai, meaning landscape based poetry. Landscape based poetry. See, due to the paucity of the time, I am unwilling to discuss this topic further. You will study these things when you start studying your optionals or take history subject seriously as one of your optionals. Okay, you will see it there, what a Tinai is and how it helps you to reconstruct history of this period. Then you have Jatak story, the stories of previous birth of Buddha, and then sculptures on the railings, pillars, gateways of architectures like stupa, stories of this is one example. What we talked about, travelers, this is one of the travelers account. A traveler had left this, we will discuss it later also. And archaeological excavations, especially the ring wells, punch mark coins, etc. And then we will see some limits of archaeology. For example, we talked about there are two types of archaeology, okay, or archaeological excavations, vertical and horizontal. Okay, vertical archaeology is cheaper, but you do not extract much information from it. Horizontal one is expensive, therefore less practiced, though historically this is more important. Okay, again this goes outside the merit of this chapter for a while. Here, read this short poem from Sangam collection. See, Sangam literature, first we said ki they are a source of history for the post-Mauryan period. Now, there are three parts of Sangam collections. You must have heard the story behind Sangam collection. Sangam means an assembly. The legend is that these poems were collected during an assembly of poets in Madurai. The legend is that there were 3 assemblies, and though the legend is rather fantastic to believe them as a history, but this is the legend behind it, that they were collected during a assembly. There are 3 parts of it. One is Tolkappiyam, it's a Tamil grammar. Second is Ittu Tokoi. And third is Pattu Papattu. These 3, what this means, these are actually 10 anthologies. An anthology is a collection of poems. So this is a collection of the collection of poems. See? And these are 10 large poems. And Tolkappiyam was the Tamil grammar. These 3 constitute the Sangam literature. Although you don't have to worry about their names yet. Okay, here what it says, that as they carry the white paddy, again the idea of Tinai comes into picture here. We will study it in optional classes. As they carry the white paddy for their land to exchange it for the salt of another, crossing the long roads in carts, through sands white as moonlight. See, through sands white as moonlight. Now, could it be a forest area, or could it be a riverine tract? Could it be a coastal area, or could it be a a desert area? Okay, so this is how a geographical landscape is woven into the poetry, and this is how you realize what was the landscape in which it was created. The way we said that it seems that Rig Ved was written in the Sapt Sindhu area. Similarly, we can say by using such poems, we can understand the landscape. We can understand what kind of trade was being practiced, whether it was an urban society or rural society. Okay, what goods they traded. Was it a long distance trade, short distance trade? Was there kingship? If there was, what was the stature of kingship? Such details could be extracted from these poems. Okay, taking whole families, so who had to be left behind, meaning it gives you a hint about the family values, that people, though even trading family, people live in a tightly knit families. The departure of salt merchants leave the city empty. Okay, so you get so many references to reconstruct the history of the period over here. And then you have a story from Jatak. This is a Jataka story. See, these are the stories of the previous life of Buddha. This is how they were written. Again, I say a religious work is not history. A religious work is used to construct history. Okay, this is the challenge here. Now, see, actually in Buddhist there are 3 important work called Tripitak in Buddhist canon. There are Sutta Pitak, then you have Vinay Pitak, and then you have Abhidhamba Pitak. Okay, Jataka story are written in the Khuddaka Nikaya, which is part of the Sutta Pitak. Okay, there are 5 Nikayas. Okay, Majjhima, Digha, Samyukta, Anguttara, and Khuddaka Nikaya in Sutta Pitak, and Jatak story is contained in the Khuddaka Nikaya. Now, what it says: once upon a time, there was a clever, poor young man who lived in a city. His only resource was a dead rat. He started off. So, first, they are talking about city. His only resource was a dead rat. He started off by selling it for a coin to a hotel for their cat. Okay. Then one day there was a storm. The king's garden was littered with branches and leaves, and the garden was at a loss as to how to clear the mess. The young man offered to clean the garden if he could keep the wood and leaves. The gardener agreed at once. The young man rounded up all the children who were playing, with an offer of sweets for every stick and leaf that they could collect. In no time, every scrap had been neatly piled near the entrance. Just then, the king's potter was on the lookout for fuel, which too. Now see, they are giving hint of different occupations. You have gardener here, you have king's potters here. Was on the lookout for fuel with which to bake his pots. So he took the whole lot and paid the young man for it. Our young man now thought of another plan. He carried a jar full of water to the city gate and offered water to 500 grass cutters. They were pleased and said, "You have done us a good turn. Tell us, what can we do for you?" He replied, I will let you know when I need your help." He then made friends with a trader. One day, the trader told him, "Tomorrow a horse dealer is coming to the town with 500 horses." See, a horse dealer is bringing, that means he is not some small scale trader, he must be a large trader. Hearing this, our young man went back to the grass cutters. He said, "Please give me a bundle of grass each and don't sell your grass till mine is sold." They agreed and gave him 500 bundles of grass. When the horse dealer could not buy grass anywhere else, he purchased the young man's grass for 1,000 coins. So, see, this is how you use a particular story to reconstruct history. A, it talks about a city landscape. B, it talks about trade and various crafts and occupations. C, it talks about the social conditions. Okay, so in this way, you use a rather religious source to construct non-religious history. This was a railing in the Sanchi Stoop. Okay, and on the railing they have made a sculpture. We had seen that sculptures are also a source of history. Okay, a railing, we call it relief sculptures. Relief sculptures on railing of Sanchi Stoop. Sanchi is in central India. See how you can construct history from it. You can see there is some kind of procession is going on here. Look at how the walls are created. You can see that they are trying to represent that walls were made of stone. But look how windows are given. Okay, how windows are made, how people are looking out of their window. Okay. Also, look at structures like these. Similar things are represented in the cave architecture of Ajanta and Ellora, meaning the cave architecture of Ajanta and Ellora are inspired from the wooden architecture of the bygone era, but those wooden architecture haven't survived, stone architecture has. So this is how you use sculptures to construct history. In fact, in last lecture we had talked about the animosity of Ajatasattu towards the Vajji Republic, and in one instance he sends his minister to talk to Buddha about how to destroy Vajji Republic. That incidence of of this story, which is very popular among in Jatak stories, it is narrated on one of the relief sculptures of Bharhut Stoop, which is in MP also. So this is how you use sculptures to study history. And story of Berigaza is a Greek word for Bharuch, and there is a book called Periplus of Erythraean Sea. It was written by an unknown Greek sailor. Periplus of Erythraean Sea. Okay, they have taken Erythraean Sea means Red Sea. So this sailor went around Indian Ocean, Persian Gulf, Red Sea area, visited different towns, ports, and narrated them. And this is one such narration about Bharuch. The Gulf is very narrow at Berigaza and very hard to navigate for those coming from sea. Ships had to be steered in by skillful and experienced local fishermen who were employed by the king. The imports into Berigaza were wine, copper. Now he is recounting the goods that were imported. He recounts imports, exports, and the topography of, for the lack of better word, the topography of the port. Though topography would not be the correct way to describe it. Okay, he lists out what were exported. Special gifts were brought by merchants for the king. These included vessels of silver, singing boys, beautiful women, fine wines, and clothes. So this is how you use travel accounts as well. Among archaeological sources, first we talked about sculptures. Okay, punch mark coins is also one archaeological source, generally rectangular or sometimes square or round in shape, either cut out of metal sheet or made out of flattened metal globules. Means suppose you have a metal sheet, okay, and then you strike it at different points. So what you are making? You are making individual coins, right? Okay, or if you have, say, small globules, you strike them and you flatten them to make a coin. The coins were not inscribed but were stamped with symbols using dies or punches. See, this is a comparison. This is an Indo-Greek coin of post-Mauryan period, and this is the punch mark coin of Mahajanpad period. Okay, this is a punch mark coin of Mahajanpad period. See, here you use a certain symbol or motif to strike it. On the reverse side there is nothing, whereas here you have the image of the king, and on the reverse side you will normally have image of a deity. So this is the Mahajanpad era punch mark coin. Okay, the coins were not inscribed but were stamped with symbols using dies or punches. Hence they are called punch mark coins. These coins are found over most parts of the subcontinent and remained in circulation till early centuries of Common Era. May be issued by trade guilds, because the logic is that if a king had issued them, then he would, either inscribe his own image, or there would be something to indicate a royalty, sovereignty. But no such thing. Only there are symbols like this, So they were maybe issued by guilds and not kings. They are earliest coin of Indian subcontinent, because even Hadappans had practiced barter. Throughout the archaeological excavation of the Harappan civilization, numerous cities and numerous other sites were excavated. They have not found evidence of coinage. So it is believed that even Harappan people, conducted their trade via barter system. But from the second urbanization in Ganga Valley, the currency system started in India. So this is from Mahajanpad period, and this is the post-Mauryan period Indo-Greek coin. Okay, so this was the comparison, how the coinage evolved. Another thing is these ring wells that were excavated during excavation in cities. Now their exact purpose is not known. Some say that they were part of some sort of sewer or drainage system, but their exact purpose is not clear. But they are invariably associated with urban structures, and you can see how tall they are. See, look at compare it, with the standing man, and look how tall they are. Though their exact purpose is not clear, but they certainly played part of some kind of drainage network in cities. Now they have given example of multifunctional cities. If you recall, we had said that how cities play their role. They are centers of trade, okay, they are centers of craft activity, they are centers of sculpture activity, they are centers of cultural activity like religious activity, etc. So various, and they also are center of political activity. Even modern cities, you can imagine, you have temples, churches, mosques, political buildings, you have business activity, art, everything going on in the cities. So the purpose of cities is that it facilitates almost every non-agrarian activity, okay. And they have given example of Mathura somewhere around this time. So it was at the crossroads of two major routes and travel routes. What happened? There was one route going from northwest towards east in Magad and Patliputra and Tamralipti port, and in here you had Takshila, Peshawar, etc. And then from the Ganga Valley you had a route going towards south. See, here you will see somewhere it. See this route. Mathura was here. So it was at the crossroad of two routes. Okay. One going from northwest to east, and then going from here to here. So definitely it will be prosperous. It was a center of art and architecture. See, you may have heard the name called Gandhara School of Art, Mathura School of Art. So in Mathura School of Art, they made statues of all three major religions: Brahminical gods, Buddhist gods and monks and Bodhisattva, and even Jain statues were made in Mathura. The Mathura School of Art, as the name suggests, it was centered around the Mathura area. Through numerous excavations, they have realized that it was a center of Krishna Bhakti, Buddhism, as well as Jainism. A political capital, Kushans made them their capital. I mean, in Indian subcontinent, they had two capitals, Peshawar and Mathura. And what are the sources? Sources to understand the history of Mathura. There are inscriptions on stone slabs and statues. See, if an artist has made a statue, he will put up an inscription highlighting that who donated, who patronized his activities, etc., who made donations. Mostly they are donative inscriptions recording grants made by kings, queens, officers, merchants, craft persons, goldsmiths, blacksmiths, weavers, basket makers, garland makers, perfumers, etc. So, see this part. What it tells you, that religious and artistic activity were patronized not only by kings and queens and higher officials, but by common people as well. See, so many occupations are mentioned as, patrons of art and cultural activities. And then they specially focus on crafts persons in cities. See, many crafts were practiced. Some of them we saw in the case of Mathura, statue making, etc. Some others like pottery making, cloth making, especially Varanasi and Madurai were famous, and there would be many such activity. For example, making tools from different sort of raw materials like stone, copper, tin, bronze, iron, silver, gold, semi-precious stone, etc. And many of the crafts cannot be identified from archaeology alone. Therefore, literary sources are important. For example, here is the example for rules for spinning and weaving given in Arthashastra. They describe how spinning and weaving could be done in workshops under the supervision of a special official. Widows, young women, and they have given a detailed list of how basically it was some sort of labor regulation, some kind of labor code to be followed in, spinning and weaving. The point we are trying to highlight here is that sometimes even literary sources are important to understand craft activity. For example, there is this book called Milind Panha. Okay, it is based on the conversation between Indo-Greek king Menander and a Buddhist monk Nagsen, and it mentions almost 60 craft activities. Artists like singers, dancers, performers. There would be no relics that will support that. Okay, this particular craft was being performed here. So often literary sources are also used to study craft. From this period, there appear this entity called Shrenis or guilds. They are known from their seals, and what they did, they were some kind of corporate body for a particular sector. Say a corporate body of goldsmiths, a corporate body of cotton traders, a corporate body of oil millers, a corporate body of garland makers. So they will be organized around one particular economic activity. For example, even in modern times, you have these strong corporate bodies for diamond cutters in Gujarat, etc. So they will be organized around one economic activity or one craft, some kind of governance body. What they will do? They will ensure the quality of goods. They will regulate the prices. They will regulate the trading conditions. And in fact, even Arthashastra says that the kings should consult these guilds to, while making economic regulations. Apart from that, they will finance the economic activity of their guild members, and sometimes make donations for religious or cultural work. In the post-Mauryan period, we get very many seals of these guilds. They have given one more example of Arikamedu. This is in Tamil Nadu. Between 200 BCE to 100 CE, they have found archaeological evidences of warehouses. It was a port town, okay, in modern Tamil Nadu. Roman amphor, these amphorae and these are examples. They are very quintessential Roman goods. So if they are found at a particular place, you can say that this is evidence of Roman trade. And not only pottery and erythine and amphorae pottery, they have found lamps, glassware and gems of Roman variety. In fact, from post-Mauryan age in South India, there are many locations you find Roman gold coins. In South India, on many coastal locations, you will find Roman gold coins. Okay, including these locations. So this is based on archaeological excavations. This we saw. Now the next chapter is traders, kings and pilgrims. This mostly focus on the events of post-Mauryan period. It says the urbanization, long distance trade, etc. continued apace during the post-Mauryan period. Prolific examples of extensive inland and maritime trade is based on establishment of Silk Route and understanding of monsoon winds. If you recall, previously in the lecture we said that in Indian subcontinent there is a seasonal reversal of winds between northeast direction and southwest direction, and using the knowledge of these winds, oceanic trade was conducted. For example, the Arikamedu excavation we talked about in the previous slide, Uttarpath, the northern route we mentioned when we were talking about the Mathura, Dakshinpath and northern black polished ware. See, these are actually very fine potteries. Northern black polished ware, very fine potteries, and they must have been made in a very small area. Meaning pottery means plates, jars, bowls, etc. And they must have been made in a very small area because they are very so specialized. Yet they are found throughout the Indian subcontinent. So it is believed that there may be 1 or 2 centers of production of NBPW, northern black polished ware, and from those centers of production they were traded across the Indian subcontinent. Also, many Roman gold coins have been found in South and Peninsular India during the post-Mauryan period. A poem about trade. Okay, this is also a Sangam poem. We can find evidence of trade in the Sangam poems. Here is one which describes the goods brought into Puhar. Puhar means modern Kaveripatnam. Puhar, Pumpuhar, Kaveripatnam. An important port on the east coast. It was, and what it says, swift prancing horses by sea in the ships. See, horses were brought by sea. Bales of black pepper in carts, gems and golds. So black pepper was obviously for export and horses were for import. Gems and gold born in the Himalayas. Sandalwood born in the western. So export. Pearls of southern areas, export. Corals from eastern oceans. Okay. The yield of the Ganga and the crops from the Kaveri. So see, the agricultural goods from Ganga Valley and Kaveri were also traded here. Foodstuffs from Sri Lanka, pottery from Myanmar and other rare and rich imports. This describes the trading activity at the Puhar. Movinder, 3 chiefs. See, in the beginning of the lecture we talked about that during the megalithic period as the megalithic cultures expanded, they gradually transitioned into the urbanization of South India. Okay, megalithic cultures eventually paved way for the first urbanization of South India. Okay, and the same interconnected process of state formation, agricultural growth, growth in trade, growth in craft specialization, that was true for north is also true for this. That during the post-Mauryan age, we first hear about Movindars, three chiefs. You can frame a prelims question here. Chiefs that controlled fertile river valleys and coastal areas. Now imagine why you want to control fertile river valleys, because you want to benefit from the agricultural growth and coastal areas. Why? Because you want to tax the trade going on in the coastal areas. Okay, became rich and powerful. So same story, that you tax the economic activities, agricultural economic activity, non-agricultural economic activity, and using that taxation money, you become powerful. There, three of them are mentioned: Cholas, Cheras, and Pandyas. At this point, each of these chiefs had two centers of power, one inland and one coastal. Of these six, Puhar or Kaveri Pattanam and Madurai were most important. So Kaveri Pattanam belonged to Cholas and Madurai was the capital of Pandyas. Okay, out of these six centers of power, two were important. They did not collect regular taxes. Okay, now though this point is given verbatim in NCERT, actually when you start studying history regularly in optionals, you will see that this point is actually debatable. There is a good historiographical debate on whether they did not collect regular taxes or not, and we will see immediately now why this is debated. So on one hand, NCERT says that they did not collect regular taxes, they demanded and received gift from people, they went on military expeditions and collected tribute from neighbors, they kept some of the wealth and distributed rest among their supporters. It sounds somewhere like, Rigvedic society. Sounds a bit like Rigvedic society. No regular taxation system, okay? They went on war, distributed war booties among their people. Role of Roman trade in promoting urbanization and state formation during this period. Why I say that a counter argument is, given here. That we see so many Roman coins at various locations in Deccan and South India, that we see that why they did not collect regular taxes. And also, if they did not collect regular taxes, why they had to control coastal areas. The reason for controlling coastal areas was that they had to collect regular taxes from trade. Also, many Sangam poets composed poems in the praise of these chiefs, Movindars, who often rewarded them with precious stones, gold, horses, elephants, craft, and fine cloth. Now you see, to reward someone with things like chariots, elephant, horses, don't you think you need a lot of resources yourself? Okay, I mean, to give such expensive gift, you need resources for yourself, and you cannot have such resources if you do not collect taxation regularly. Therefore, I have highlighted this point, that this point is given, as this is actually verbatim from NCERT. However, in regular studies, you will see that these points actually contradict each other. Okay, from chiefdoms to kingdom. See, this discussion, when you take up, regular studies for civil service examination, there you will see why they are contradicting each other here. That on one hand, you have so many resources, that you are giving such lavish gift, but on the other hand, you are saying they did not collect regular taxes. From chiefdom to kingdom. Around 100 BCE, Satvahan dynasty became powerful in Western India, specifically in the Maharashtra and Andhra region. Okay, Satvahanas were Dakshinpath Swami. What is Dakshinpath? See, though it is not clearly mentioned here, but this part is the Satvahan. Okay, Dakshinpath means route leading to south. That means they control this area. And now, why you want to control a trade route? So that you can tax it. Using tax, you create a powerful state machinery, which was also used as a name for the entire southern region. So Dakshinpath can either mean the entire southern region or the routes leading to the south. The most important king of Satvahan dynasty was Gautamiputra Sri Satkarni. and we know about him from an inscription by Gautami Balashri, his mother. Actually, this inscription is in a cave at Nasik. Okay. How do we know about them? The sources are coins issued by Satavahan kings, inscriptions, for example, this one, and other inscriptions at places called Junnar, etc. And even Puranas mention them. In many of the Purana stories, Satavahanas are mentioned as Andhras. Okay. The world famous Ajanta caves began to be excavated, hewed out of the mountains during the time of Satavahanas. The Sanchi Stoop, which was originally commissioned by Ashok, was repaired by Satavahan kings. Okay, so they are very important in the history of Deccan. And the relationship between the expansion of material culture from Ganga Valley towards Deccan during the Mauryan period and the rise of local empire, what is the relationship? Was it entirely inspired from Mauryan Empire, or the material culture transferred by Mauryan Empire to Deccan, or was there any local initiative? What was the role of agricultural growth? What was the role of trade? These things are covered when you take up your regular studies of history. Silk Route, trade, kingdom and missionaries. Now see, silk is obviously fashionable. It is fashionable even now. The art of silk making, or silk, making silk fabric from the cocoon of mulberry silkworm, and making clothes out of is actually very thousands of years old. And this art, this technique was perfected in China roughly around 500 BCE at that time. And for thousands of years, that trade secret was maintained. They maintained this intellectual property. So, such was the attraction of this silk that people as far as Roman Empire wanted to buy it. So, this was the first inspiration behind creation of Silk Route. However, many other goods were traded along the route. In fact, the goods from India that went to West were also often traded along Silk Route. Silk Route not only had land component, it also had sea component. We saw that how from Takshashila via Indus River route went to the Arabian Sea, and from Arabian Sea it went to Persian Gulf and Red Sea, and from there to Roman Empire and Mediterranean world. Similarly, from Indian ports like Tamralipti in Bengal, Arikamedu, Poduka in Tamil Nadu, and from Bharuch, Barabarikam on the western side, a sea route went towards Southeast Asia, and from Southeast Asia towards China. So it had both land and marine component. See here, it has marine components as well, going towards west and going towards Southeast Asia via Southeast Asia to China. And this is the route I am talking about from Takshashila. So you had a land marine route as well. So if a good, say from Ganga Valley, has to go to west, it can either go via the say if it's a good produced in the Ganga Valley that has to go towards west, it can come here and via it can go, or it can go via here. So Silk Route was used not only for silk but other goods as well. So it was used for trade, it was used for traveling. Who will travel? Pilgrims, okay, merchants, soldiers, etc. I mean, these locations, though it is not clearly visible on the map, Khotan, Yarkand, Kashgar, they have some of the oldest Buddhist caves where the Buddhist sculptures and architecture is present. So it tells you that via Silk Route, Buddhism went towards China, Central Asia and Tibet. Kushanas, they came after Shakas, okay. Though we will study about the Kushanas and their significance in the social and political history of India in rather proper studies. They had two capitals at Peshawar and Mathura. From Central Asia via Indus River to Roman Empire, they controlled a segment of Silk Route here. In fact, Chinese sources tell us that due to their control over Silk Route, they became very rich. This part given in red, it is believed that, sorry, green, it is believed that this much was was under the control of Kushanas. This, at least this route. Okay. In fact, their prosperity can be, explained by this argument as well, that they were the earliest rulers to issue gold coins that were also used along the Silk Route. They are the earliest rulers to issue gold coins in India. Now see, there is this contradiction here. In old NCERT, they have given that Indo-Greeks were the first to issue gold coins. And in new NCERT, in NCERT of 12th class, they have given the Kushanas were the earliest. So since new one will have updated information, so we have to go by that. Okay. So that tells you about their prosperity. Later, during the Gupta period, Gupta Empire, the quality and quantity of gold coins went higher. But they were the first one to issue gold coins. In fact, their gold coins were modeled along the Roman gold coins. Okay. They were inspired from Roman gold coins in terms of their purity, in terms of their metallurgy, in terms of their standards, and they were used along the entire Silk Route. Buddhism spread to Central Asia, Tibet and China via Silk Route, especially the Mahayana Buddhism. See what we said. Now if you recall, the 4th Buddhist Council was held in Kashmir Valley. Here there was a schism in Buddhism and Heenan and Mahayana Buddhism developed. And from here, Mahayana Buddhism went to Central Asia, Tibet and China via this route. In fact, this Kashgar, Yarkand, Khotan areas, they have, some of the oldest Buddhist cave architecture. See, here you have Khotan, Kashgar, etc. And this was the Silk Route. Now, a new form of Buddhism. Kanishk, he was a Kushan ruler. He was a Kushan ruler, okay, and under him 4th Buddhist Council was held somewhere in Kashmir Valley, though we do not know where exactly. There have been 4 Buddhist councils. The first 3 were held in Bihar, modern day Bihar. The 4th was held in Kashmir Valley. It was presided by Ashwaghosh. He wrote the biography of Buddha in Sanskrit called Buddha Charit. Here, Buddhism was divided into Heenan Buddhism and Mahayana Buddhism. Though there are many doctrinal differences between Mahayana and Heenan, there are 2 important ones. A, introduction of idea of Bodhisattva. I mean, these are the enlightened beings that, though they have attained enlightenment, they postpone their, departure from this world because they want to help out the human beings, each and every human being, to attain nirvana as well. Okay, and from here the idea of compassion enters into a moral idea of compassion enters into the discussion. On the second, idol worship. It is possible that this component was inspired from the Hellenistic art. Okay, earlier Buddha was worshipped in the form of symbols. For example, if you want to represent the first sermon, you represent the Dharmachakra Pravartan wheel. Okay, if you want to represent his enlightenment, so you represent the people tree. If you want to represent the moment when he renounced the world and left, so you present it by horse. Okay, to represent his death, you have this empty throne. So earlier he was represented in symbols. But in Mahayana Buddhism, he was worshipped in the form of statues. And not only Buddha, even important Bodhisattvas were also worshipped in the form of statues. So the idol worship entered into Indian subcontinent, possibly, I mean, it's a theory, via the Hellenistic art, which first emerged in Indian subcontinent in the form of Gandhara school of art and then in Mathura school of art. So though there are historiographical debates here that will be covered in later classes in higher studies. So first, idol worship and Bodhisattva were 2 new features, and it went to Central Asia, Tibet and China via Silk Route. You see the location, you can clearly understand. Whereas Buddhism also spread to Western and Southern India. In previous slides we talked about Satvahan dynasty. Under the Leadership of Satvahan dynasty, Sanchi Stoop was repaired and enlarged. Ajanta caves started to be hewed out from that time. Even there, in Ajanta caves, earlier caves belonged to Heenyan, but later caves belong to Mahayan. Okay, even there you can see, in Mahayan caves you will have images and statues. In Heenyan caves you would not have images and statues. So Buddhism also spread to western and southern India, and in that case also Buddhism spread via trade routes. Okay, even there it's spread via trade routes, Uttar Path, Dakshin Path, etc. Many of the Buddhist caves are located next to trade routes. Okay, kings, queens, merchants and craft persons, etc. patronize Buddhism. Now each class, there are theoretical ideas, there are theories to emphasize that why ruling class supported Buddhism, why merchant class supported Buddhism, why common folks supported Buddhism, because each of them found something refreshing in Buddhism, each of them found something empowering in Buddhism, each of them were uplifted. So these things again are subject matter for higher studies. And then Buddhist caves hewed out near transit passes. What we say, that Buddhism went to western and southern India from Ganga Valley, but there also it went via trade routes. And many of the Buddhist caves are hewed out near important trade passes and trade routes. Okay. Theravada Buddhism spread to Southeast Asia. How? Under the patronage of Ashok. We all know he sent his son and daughter to Sri Lanka, and Theravada Buddhism via ports like Tamralipti, etc. This is the earlier form. Before this schism between Mahayana and Heenyan Buddhism, this is the earlier form, which is the Tripitaka we talked about. The Tripitaka belonged to the Theravada Buddhism. They went to Southeast Asia, Sri Lanka, Myanmar. So there Theravada Buddhism is famous. Pilgrims traveled along with trade routes, and the accounts of pilgrims also act as sources for us. The most famous example is Fayan. Okay. See, Fayan came to India and went back via land route. But Huansang, known as Huanzhang, he went via Southeast Asia's sea route. And both of them described their journey when they went back to their homeland and wrote their accounts. Earlier we saw an example from Periplus of Erythraean Sea, how someone has described the port city of Bharuch. So pilgrims traveled along these routes as well. What we are doing here, we are emphasizing the importance of trade routes, not only for economic activity but for political activity. I mean, Kushans became powerful by taxing the trade. For cultural activity, pilgrims and religions are spread via trade routes. Also during the post-Mauryan period, a new form of religion, you can say, or a new stage of in the evolution of Hinduism emerged. See, early Vedic religion was simple: prayer, simple sacrifices at the household level, rather inexpensive. But the excessive ritualism of later Vedic period inspired a reaction, what we had seen in the chapter on new ideas and new questions. Heterodox sects like Buddhism and Jainism and Upanishadic philosophy. Also at the same time, many socio-economic and political changes had taken place. If you remember, we had said one thing, that material changes inspire ideological changes. Okay, material changes inspire changes in belief, values, etc. Similarly, the excessive ritualism of later Vedic period inspired new ideas, new questions, and many socio-economic changes like urbanization, state formation, agricultural growth, social inequality, etc. were taking place. So due to these changes, even there were changes in pantheon of gods in the Brahminical religion, Brahmanism. Okay. Many changes were taking place. Earlier, Indra, Agni, Varun, they were important gods. But during later Vedic period, Prajapati, Vishnu, Shiv, Rudra became important. Actually, Shiva and Rudra are same. Up to this period, Shiva, Vishnu and Durga came to the forefront. Okay, they became the most important gods in the Brahminical pantheon. And actually, there are socio-economic reasons behind it. The reasons, actually I'm compelled, not to cover these reasons here, because then we have to talk about things like land grants, then we have to talk about the assimilation of tribals and non-tribal, tribals and forest dwellers and non-Aryans into the Vedic society. Okay, what was the outcome of these confluences? Then we talk about the influence of Puranas on the religion. Then we talk about incarnations and Avatarvad. So there are many such social and economic changes that inspired changes in the pantheons of God. You will study them in detail in optional classes. On one hand, idol worship emerged in the Buddhism, in the Gandhara school of art. Now in Gandhar region, which is the modern day eastern Afghanistan and North Pakistan and some parts of India, mostly images of Buddha were made. But in Mathura school of art, not only images of Buddha, but images of Jain monks, okay, Jain, Mahavir, Parshvanath, etc. Their images were also made. And apart from Buddhism and Jainism, many of the images of Brahminical gods like Shiva, Vishnu and Durga were also made. These deities were worshipped via bhakti. Anybody rich or poor, so-called high or low caste, man or woman, could follow the path of bhakti. So here you see an example of social reform. That, if you recall, performing Vedic sacrifices and reading Vedas were forbidden for women and Shudras. The elaborate and expensive rituals, though they were theoretically open to people of Brahminical, Kshatriya and Vaishya Varna, however, they were so expensive that obviously only a rich can do, a rich person can perform them. So there were many disempowering features, many exclusionary features of that religion. What happened here? That rich or poor, high or low caste, man or woman, anybody could follow the path of bhakti. That means it was again a simple mode of worship. The system of bhakti emphasized individual worship of a deity rather than the performance of elaborate sacrifices. Now, how do you worship them? You go to temples, you perform simple rituals, you recite mantra, you fast, you go on pilgrimage. Bhagavad Gita, the lessons of Bhagavad Gita, where especially the discussions between Krishna and Arjun, are good example of early forms of Bhaktism. The deity could be worshipped in any form, human, anthropomorphic, animal, natural element, and here the idea of Avatarvad comes. Often gods take the different avatar incarnation, which are semi-human and half animals, etc. And the animals in natural element, etc. Idol worship and possibly temple cult started at this period. Though we do not have any surviving temple from post-Mauryan period, but there are many hints found during the archaeological excavations that though some temples must have been created at this period. The earliest standing temples actually belong to the Gupta era. But there are archaeological evidences to suggest that temple cult had already started at this point. And idol worship not only in Buddhism but Brahminism as well. So see, the idea is you are supposed to worship God at the individual level. So you consecrate idols in your home, you consecrate idols in temples, etc. Bhakti, and later on Bhakti inspired art, sculptures like statues, architecture like temples, poetry, especially the Bhakti poetry of Bhakti Sants in numerous parts of India, and socio-political movement. Bhakti movement, especially during the medieval period, became a very powerful movement. So with this we are ending the chapter 10, and this is the end of lecture 4. Rest of the 2 chapters will be seen in the lecture 5. Thank you.